Hey, deserving listeners, a lot of you have been asking me to watch Baby Reindeer on Netflix. I was getting a lot of requests through various different communication vectors, and I was kind of on the fence because I'm pretty busy with other things. But then my parents told me I have to watch this. And I thought, well, okay, my parents are saying so, I better watch it.
I would like to report something. How does it work?
What would you like to report?
I don't know how to tell you this, but I'm getting stalked.
By a man or a woman?
A woman.
And have you had a sexual relationship with this woman?
No, I haven't. She's...
All right, so full disclosure, I've already watched all the episodes. I watched the whole series. And the reason is because I sat down to watch a little bit of it just to see if it was worth making a reaction video. And I was so hooked by how good the show was that I basically just watched it all in 2 or 3 different sittings. And it's such a well-made show. The second thing I'll say is there has never been a more important show to have a trigger warning with. This show depicts not only stalking very effectively and in a comprehensive way, but also it depicts the way in which you can get pulled into an extremely abusive relationship. And it's graphic as well. There are rape scenes, and it's really hard to watch even if you don't have PTSD around this or trauma reactivity around this. But if you do, and I've talked with friends of mine who were unaware, especially episode 4, where it really gets depicted in a very graphic, important way. I'm glad the show exists, but a friend of mine watched it and was a little bit triggered by it through the stalking footage or, depiction. But episode 4, it's just unrelenting how effective and accurate and important, but in that way, it will trigger people if there's any residual trauma reactivity. Even if you've been through a lot of recovery. My friend has been through decades of recovery. I mean, she's a therapist herself. She knows her stuff. And what we see right now is Donnie reporting to the police that he's being stalked by a woman, and how hard that might be to report to the police. The vast majority of people don't report to the police at all, let alone men being stalked, let alone men being stalked by women.
Look, they're in here somewhere, okay? I just need to sift through all of the... Look, I'm really worried here. I think she needs help.
How long has it been going on for?
I don't know,
And Donnie says, I think she needs help. And that is the solution often. I have a friend who owns a security company, a high-end security company, where he does security for people like Bill Gates and these kind of people. And you can imagine the kind of stalkers or threats or security risks that someone like Bill Gates would have. And with stalkers, the approach, which I found to be very interesting because, security are, these are people that aren't very related to mental health, let's just say. They're often military, ex-military or ex-police or ex-CIA or FBI or something. And I wouldn't think that they would be very mental health oriented, but when I talk with him, he says that's 95% of what we do, is figuring out how to get the stalker the support, the mental health support that they need, and the support system that they need. And a big part of what they will do is they will, through investigation, figure out the stalker's family and reach out to them and begin a dialogue of, did you know that your family member is doing this? Is there something we can do to help? So when Donnie says, I think she needs help, that's wise.
Can't chat long.
She always ordered the same drink every time, Ma.
Diet Coke, plenty ice.
And I always gave it to her on the house.
She never drank her drink.
I'm representing some big clients at the moment.
Instead, she would sit there on autopilot, monologuing breathlessly about people in her life without ever explaining who they were.
All right, so this is a very interesting dynamic and really points in the direction of this actually being a true story, because the writer, director, actor, the guy who plays Donnie as the writer, director, which is just amazing to think about, writing, directing, and acting in one of the best TV shows that's ever been made. And it lends itself to that credibility because the specificity of the dynamic and the personalities. So for her, what is being depicted is narcissism. Often online, narcissism is just another word for evil or psychopath or antisocial. But real narcissism, in my world, is this, where they just talk and talk and talk, and they will find people that are good listeners who don't even seem to care if they get in a word in edgewise. In fact, they might even be gravitated towards people who don't want to talk, who don't want to put themselves out there because of their own traumas. They want to have someone fill that space because they're ashamed of themselves, or they hate themselves, or they have trauma about extending themselves, and they want contact. So a narcissistic person who just yammers and yammers and yammers, it gives them at least a semblance of connection and relationship. And with Donnie, we see that only someone like him would even tolerate someone like her. Anyway, so with these two, what we're seeing is, and what we know from later, given how she presents Martha, is narcissistic personality. Someone who is very self-centered, has impaired empathy, but impaired, is very sure. So I guess I'll just cut to the chase and tell you what my analysis of her is. And I haven't really formally taken notes or thought about it, but just off the top of my head. For some people with a particular type of narcissistic personality, they will stalk people. And the reason for that is that in my model and my experience treating people that do this is that you have to understand where it comes from. So where it comes from is early in life they were neglected, either in very overt, noticeable ways, like they were in an orphanage, or the parents were subtly neglecting, very much neglecting, but it wouldn't be noticeable from the outside. Like if the parents were working a lot, or suffering from some sort of health problem and were in and out of the hospital, or the parents were raised by very standoffish parents themselves and therefore just were very standoffish with their own kids. They cared about their kids, but their noticing, their attunement was pretty limited. Or one or both of the parents was depressed. That's another example. So there are many routes to a child, 0 to 2, 0 to 3, where they are reaching out for interaction. They're bidding with crying or laughing or being fussy or reaching out. And the parents are either just not there physically or not there emotionally. And when children are faced with that at a significant level, which it has to be in order for this sort of thing to develop, they are faced with a dilemma. They have to figure out a solution to this. And of course, this isn't conscious, and they aren't even verbal necessarily yet. So they just have to figure out a way to cope. And one of the available coping styles is narcissism, which is this decision that the individual makes, again, subconsciously, that they can't rely on other people. They have to rely on themselves. And therefore, they can't be protected by other people. And children are inherently afraid of everything because they don't know how anything works. And so they need someone to be competent. And so they just invent that they are competent. They say they're superior, they know everything, they're good at everything, because it's a comfort to them, a needed comfort to them, that at least someone is in control, that knows what they're doing, because they're not getting that from the outside. They also say, I don't need other people. I'm completely fine on my own, even though they are not fine on their own. But they need to believe that because there's no other choice. They have to figure out a way to cope with what's happening to them. So that is solidified repeatedly throughout their life, because the neglect early in life often persists. And they, through their behavior, push a lot of people away. They even actively avoid getting close to people for those reasons, and therefore never get their needs met. So by the time they're older, they've had a lifetime of neglect, and they've even participated in a lot of it themselves by having relationships where they end up being neglected. And so they're a walking raw nerve of attachment insecurity and insecurity in general, feeling like they have no worth. Because that's one of the major conclusions that they came to 0 to 3, because that's how they're being treated. That it's natural for a child to conclude, the reason why I'm being neglected is because I don't matter. I'm worthless. I'm nothing. I'm like lower than like the dog. I don't have any inherent value at all. So I'm going to overcompensate by being on a constant treadmill of narcissistic supply, telling me that I am not only worth it, but I am better than everyone else, because I need to tell myself that to counteract this massive sea of insecurity that I have. Also, these individuals will, with most, if not all, personality disorders, they will retain the childish black and white thinking. All children enter the world with this mentality of all good, all bad. And when they are young, they never graduate out of that because they don't have enough interactions to develop out of that. That when we interact with people, we wrestle with that conundrum of all good, all bad, and eventually we graduate to a point where we see our parents and ourselves as mostly good, but with a little bit of bad. That gray area is important to slowly develop into and neurologically establish. Without that, you can be 45 and still be a black and white thinker. So you can't just be mostly a good person to counteract how low you feel. You have to be all good. You have to be 100%. There can't be any flaw in there, any criticism. There can't be any inferiority or any mediocrity, because if you believe that about yourself, then everything comes crashing down and you're nothing. Also, you need everyone around you to believe that, because in order to believe that you're superior, you need to make sure everyone else sees you that way, because if other people don't look at you that way, then you're like, oh no, am I not? It's all this effort to avoid this ongoing pain, and it's deep, deep pain that they feel. So what that can develop into in later in life is yammering, where you're like a child that is uninterested in other people's thoughts, and because you've never been given the attention and the attunement that you deserved growing up. So you're in this constant effort to try to get that attunement that you lacked growing up. And so you're in that state pretty much all the time when you're plus you're running away from annihilation and complete lack of any worth. So you're always like, look at me, 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 please look at me, look at me. Plus it also distracts you from having to slow down and recognize just how crappy your life is and how crappy you are as a human being. And then, so there's that yammering and look at me, and lack of stopping to ask the other person a question, because you're frantic and you also just don't have that developmental ability to mentalize what's going on in other people's minds. The narcissistic yammer, it's cognitively impossible for them to recognize how they're coming across to other people. They don't even know. They've never been given that chance. They've never been able to slow down because they're in a constant, just narcissistic supply, particularly at higher ends of the spectrum. The other thing is that they're running around with a lot of attachment security. They've never been given any sort of attachment security, so they are desperate. All the things we know about borderline, what I say is underneath every narcissistic person is a borderline person. And so they are desperate for closeness naturally, right? And they also don't have the know-how or the ways to bid for that. They can't calmly date or calmly, nicely ask, hey, could you hug me or pay attention to me or love me or so, because that would be inferior. Also, that wasn't modeled to them growing up, so it's just a foreign thing. But they want closeness like anyone else does, so what do? They stalk, they control. And what this does is it meets the fantasy, because they will invent a fantasy that, as she did, that the target is actually secretly in love with them, because that is the only way they see the world, but it also helps them to feel secure, right? It's not ideal, but it's the only thing that'll work within their defensive structure. Also, they will find someone subconsciously that is unavailable, someone who shows no interest in them and isn't likely ever to be with them. So they might choose someone that is a bartender, someone who isn't really there to interact with you as a social interaction. They're just working, The other thing is, if you're a yammer or a narcissistic person, subconsciously or consciously that to come to a bar, the bartender can't escape. The bartender has to sit there and deal with you, because other people, like if you walked up to someone at work or at the bus stop or someone who lives near you, through experience that those people can ditch you at any point they feel like it, or eventually, right? Bartenders are just sitting there. There's other jobs that are like this too, but bartenders are really susceptible to it because for 8 hours they have to, especially in a bar where there's only one bartender that's working behind the bar. Anyway, I'm sure every bartender has this kind of experience, or I'm guessing they often do. Anyway, so the other aspect of the stalking is that it recreates the past relationship, in that the person is unavailable and unlikely to actually engage. So through recreation, through projective identification and repetition compulsion, this is all psychoanalytic psychobabble to some extent, but it pans out as a model for human weirdness that we all do, that we all recreate our past relationships for better or for worse, is the way that I see it. Not everyone sees it that way. Some people just see it that we recreate our bad relationships, but arguably you could say we recreate our good relationships as well, the models that we learned growing up. And one of the, at least the psychodynamic explanation, and it pans out to me, there's a number of reasons why we recreate these past relationships. So to be specific, for the Martha character, she likely was heavily neglected growing up when she was 0 to 3, and she is getting a lot of her defensive needs met through her interaction with Donnie, because she's able to yammer. She's also able to fantasize that he's in love with her because she needs that to feel close to someone. And she gets to recreate the past relationship because he is quiet and standoffish and not likely to actually engage with her, right? And she might even make sure that happens, that he won't engage with her by being off-putting the way that she ends up being, and by yammering, right? So the recreation, why do we do that? Why do we have a subconscious need to recreate past relationships? The classic example is that you are abused by one of your parents, and then you proceed to marry someone that's abusive, and you think, why did this happen? How could this happen? I know what abuse looks like. I know what an abusive person looks like. I know the signs of an abusive person. You'd think I would know to avoid something like, how did this happen? Well, because this is at least the model of understanding this. And through projective identification, repetition compulsion, recreation, reenactments, these are all psychoanalytic terms, that have very rich explanations that I won't get into. But one of the reasons is it's comfortable, right? The associations that we make, because unfortunately for the Marthas of the world, when they were being neglected, they were also getting occasional attunement, right? And occasional love and attention. And they associate that neglect with love and attunement. And so it becomes neurologically bound. And so when they look for that attunement and attention, they will naturally bring all their associations with it, right? So they will bring the neglect. And so they're recreating based on familiarity, but they're also recreating because they're trying to rework the past. So there's this effort. So for the person who chooses an abusive partner, they, at least this is the model, there's no way to really prove this scientifically, but it pans out, that you are trying to rework. You wished it went differently when you were a kid. You wished you didn't go through abuse. You wished you had more power, or that you managed to convince them or something. And you can't go back in time. You want to, but you can't. So you recreate it subconsciously in the present, and then you proceed to try to rework that as a proxy for reworking the past. And that can work, actually, if things work well. Like an example is you were abused, and then you find someone that has elements of control and abuse, but you work hard to work on your relationship with that person. You go to couples therapy, and you actually manage to, through your own power and differentiation and open communication, manage to rework that slightly abusive person and your victim maneuverings into a more healthy relationship style. And that's a corrective experience that actually does somewhat rewrite the past, or at least correct for the past, right? That can happen, but often it doesn't happen because we pick someone that is so like our parent when we were growing up that they're unlikely to change, and we kind of need it to be that way. Anyway, I won't go down that road. But so the stalking is an element of narcissism, and that's how I see it. It's not usually explained that way. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone explain it this way, but it makes total sense to me, and it's extremely well depicted in this series. And another element is that she also has a lot of rage eventually that emerges toward Donnie and maybe others, but particularly towards Donnie. And where does that rage come from? Well, the child that was being neglected naturally was very hurt and thus very angry. So they carry with them a lot of anger. This is what I guess maybe people are referring to when they say narcissistic rage. Online, if you just Google narcissistic rage, 99%, in my opinion, they have no idea what they're talking about. But that's what this depicts well. When it turns that corner and Donnie starts to push back, she gets very angry. It's the same that you will see in young children, that your kid's a little grumpy, maybe your kid needs a nap, and or not, and you're busy. Maybe particularly if you have another child, a younger child, and you're giving that child attention, and your older child is hurt by that and will express that at times through anger. They might even throw a tantrum, right? Well, it's still there because they've never developed out of that. But of course, an adult who is angry with a cell phone and power can do a lot more damage than a 2-year-old who's throwing a tantrum. The other element of narcissism, and this is more of the extreme level on the spectrum that is depicted well, is that she feels like she owns him. She owns his life. She owns his body. And that's exhibited as the season goes on. And that's the way little children will think. They, and rightfully so, believe they are entitled to certain things from their parents, right? They're entitled to attention and love and time. They're entitled to having the parents take care of them and be with them and respond to their bids for love and attention. We don't usually word it that way, but you would want an infant to feel entitled to those normal, healthy things, right? Well, that entitlement, if provided for effectively, the child will develop into a more well-rounded human being later on, even at the age of like 4 or 5, by toning down their entitlement, right? By thinking, well, I've been given a lot. I don't feel like I deserve everything anymore. But if you are never given that, then you retain that entitlement and that anger and that feeling like you deserve it and you don't need to worry about other people's feelings. A 2-year-old shouldn't and doesn't necessarily care that much about the parents' feelings. We don't see 2-year-olds as little psychopaths, but in terms of our adult-to-adult understanding of entitlement, we could see it that way, but none of us would see it that way because we understand and really want our 2-year-olds to be self-centered, right? And if that is retained and plays out in adult behavior, it will and can look like stalking and like rape. And the other element of severe narcissism that is depicted well, which I really want to emphasize here, is that we get a glimpse of Martha's life when she's not around Donnie. Her life is not going well. She does not look happy. She does not look like she's thriving, right? We get glimpses of her at home just like looking sad or depressed or demoralized or just not doing well, right? And that is the case for people with narcissistic personality. It's tempting and it's culturally normal to see narcissistic people as people that we need to tear down, and they deserve to be torn down. And maybe they do under certain justice efforts, like it depends on what we mean by tearing down. But baseline, they see themselves as the lowest of the low. They see themselves as inferior to everybody and everything that's ever existed. So you don't need to tear them down anymore. And the treatment involves actually bringing them up, which might sound kind of funny that when the effective treatment for narcissism is not to bring them down, but it's actually to bring them up so they don't need to be narcissistic anymore. It's complicated. Listen to my deep dives on narcissistic personality disorder. So we see that, and we don't, I think, see a scene where she loses her grip on her defenses, but a common, if not universal, thing that I will hear from people with severe narcissistic personality is in all of their efforts to get narcissistic supply and to constantly convince themselves and everyone around them that they're superior. I'm superior, right? I'm superior. I mean, it's just constant. It's just a constant treadmill that they have to run. Eventually, things are going to happen where that effort will break down somehow. Maybe they get fired from a job, or they get divorced, someone divorces them, or something else. And the floor will just fall out from underneath them. And they will fall into that abyss of nothingness and annihilation and worthlessness. And they will feel that pain very acutely, and they will not be able to claw their way out of it immediately. And typically it'll be done in isolation because they're isolated anyway, but also they tend to isolate because they don't trust other people. They don't even really think to reach out to other people. They'll just be suffering. And so sometimes they'll turn to substances. It could last a couple days. It could last a couple weeks. But eventually they'll start to rebuild back their defenses, and then they will go from that state immediately to superiority state again. If you watch my reaction videos to 90 Day Fiancé, there's a character that exhibits this. I'm not diagnosing from afar, but the presentation is an example of a presentation that I would have an hypothesis about narcissistic personality. The 90 Day Fiancé cast member is not severe by any means, but has that pattern. I don't think we saw that in this season. And, it wouldn't be necessarily to tell a good story. Also, the Donnie character wouldn't necessarily ever see that because they will isolate.
Like I knew them already, like I was already a part of her life. And when she wasn't speaking about them or her law firm or all the famous people she knew, she would sit there talking about me.
Yeah. So name dropping, lying that she's the owner of a law firm, that she's a lawyer, and all of that grandiosity, and in a package that is not typical to what we think of when we think of narcissism, or at least I don't think so. I think most people, when they think of someone with narcissistic personality, they don't think of someone like her. They think of someone with more power, usually a man, but believe me, there are a lot of women with narcissistic personality disorder, a lot. Arguably, half of the people with narcissistic personality identify as women. If you look at the research, they'll say a third, but still, it's a huge percentage. But when we actually look at it more closely in terms of the methods of that research, it is possible that the people who identify as women, present as women, are in between narcissism and borderline, and they're just categorized as borderline. And men are in between, they're categorized as narcissistic, because there's a fair amount of overlap there, and it depends on how you're looking at things. It's pretty easy for me, particularly at higher ends of the spectrum, pretty easy for me to differentiate with some pretty important markers. But anyway, so we're also hearing that she showers him with praise. So this is another element of narcissism. It's not always the case, but when you are in their good graces and you're giving them their narcissistic supply, because they're black and white thinkers and because they need you so much, they will idealize you in a similar way that a borderline person will, in exactly the same way a borderline person will, because it's like, oh my God, finally someone is paying attention to me. Oh my God, I'm like, stay with me. You're the best, you're the best, you're the best. But also because since you are in their circle now, you must be superior. You must be better than other people. And if you're like Donnie and you suffer self-esteem issues, then you're going to eat that up and you're going to need it. And that was depicted very well in the show, very well in the show. The Donnie motivation to go back to these two abusive individuals as it relates to his self-esteem and his past traumas is only someone who has been through this could write something like this, as he has said. And actually, let's look at the articles, because I'm guessing some of you haven't watched the show or won't watch it. So this article is on therap.com, and it's talking about Baby Reindeer, and it says that the show is the most watched English show in its second week with 13.3 million. But it's also kind of interesting that so many people would be watching this because it's so hard to watch, you know. But what a wonderful thing that, I mean, one, it's a great show, but it's alerting a lot of people that wouldn't be alerted to this normally. Yeah, and I read that the writer, director, actor, Richard Gadd, he originally had this as a solo play that he did on stage called Baby Reindeer. And Baby Reindeer, by the way, is the nickname that the stalker had for him, which is another narcissistic thing, actually. Not all the time, and not everyone that does this is narcissistic, but narcissistic people tend to apply nicknames to people whether the person wants it or not. Think of certain politicians that always do this, because the individual, one, their impaired empathy means that they don't notice or care that the nickname bothers the other person, but also they want to have control over the individual and the name, or they don't like your name, so they'll just change it because it feels better to them, which really just emphasizes how narcissistic that is. It's like, yeah, I don't like your name, I'm going to change it. It's like, wow. So the nicknames that she had, plus the nickname Baby Reindeer, is both endearing, right, and overpowering, because Baby Reindeer, very weak and vulnerable, right? Also, according to him, he says the show has been only lightly fictionalized. And of course, with its popularity, but even if it wasn't very popular, there's a lot of people online trying to figure out who the two individuals are. Not only the Martha character, but this individual who plays Darian. people trying to figure out who that person is. And when I first heard that the show was based on a true story, I thought, and he did say that he changed some aspects of the individuals to mask the identities. And as a therapist that educates publicly and in my classrooms and presents cases, I'm well versed in how to do that, whenever I talk about a case, I'm always changing details to mask the identity, such that maybe even the person I'm talking about won't even know I'm talking about them, But the meaning of the story is still the same, the point of it is still the same. I don't change those details. But I wondered if he changed the genders of the individuals or other aspects of it. But some people online, as of today, which is April 28th, have said they've figured out likely candidates for the two individuals. And Gad has come forward saying, no, don't try to figure out who these people are, please. That's not the point. I don't want that to happen. So on one hand, my opinion is he's the victim. Like earlier when I was talking about the proper way to interview an individual like this and advocate for them is not to take over and try to find these people, but to give the victim power. Let them make that choice. Say, I really want to go after these people. What do you want to do though? Because I don't want to be another person that controls and overpowers you and puts you in harm's way, right? So what do you want to do? And that's important. On the other hand, these two individuals are horrific individuals, particularly that guy, because that guy has power. At least the Martha character, if depicted accurately, it would be hard for her to find other victims. Not impossible, but it's harder. For him, he could be victimizing people almost every day, given his position of power. He's a producer of some kind, TV producer, right? The character. Or he's in the biz. And that guy, if depicted somewhat accurately, has probably raped hundreds of people, similar to Harvey Weinstein, very similar kind of character. Or Bill Cosby, there's similarities because of the drugs used and that kind of thing. So on the other hand, I think, well, those people need to be stopped. And they deserve to be outed in the same way that Bill Cosby deserved to be outed and Harvey Weinstein deserved to be outed. I mean, this is the whole thing, the Me Too movement, right? On the other hand, Gad, Richard Gad doesn't want us to do that. So I don't know what to think. The other thing I think is, well, what did you think was going to happen, Richard Gad? Like, you depicted two horrific individuals. In today's day and age, people are going to look it up. And if you didn't change the details much, it's not going to be hard. Apparently, and I don't know if this is accurate, the guy that they think is that guy looks like that guy. The real guy looks like that guy. And the Martha character is based on someone that, I don't know about physical presentation, but the stalking behaviors, there's apparently evidence that the individual that they think is the person was banned from the bar that he worked at, was tweeting about him all the time. I'm not saying it's accurate. I know enough about these things to know that the internet will target people that have nothing to do with these stories because the internet is the way that it is, and completely innocent people. So under no circumstances should the internet mob actually go after these people. What should happen is the police should be informed and encouraged to investigate. Unless it's undoubtable, unless we're just like, no, there's no possible way it's anyone other than that person. I don't know. What do you think? The other thing about this that is depicted so well, and only someone who's been through this could actually depict it in this way, is that his feelings towards his two abusers are different. The Martha character and then the Darian character, was that his character's name, are different in that he at times has sympathy and compassion for Martha. Whereas for Darian, that wasn't exhibited, right? because the way that Martha and Darian victimized him, it was a different style. And I've worked with a number of clients who were unfortunately not only victimized by someone like Martha or Darian, but they were victimized by multiple people, some like Martha and some like Darian. And what will happen is that when you're being treated by someone like Darian, and then you're treated by Martha, the way that Martha was treating him, to the Richard Gadd, to the Donnie character, you would say, well, at least Martha has some humanity, right? There's some care there and some vulnerability there. The Darian person, I mean, he's like a sadistic psychopath, and those people do exist. And so at least with Martha, I feel some humanity and some safety, not entirely, of course, but some power, some a little bit there. It's still not, but by contrast. And so for the victim, they sometimes will value that. And even after going through a lot of recovery, I did an episode a few years back. It's titled Surviving Sex Trafficking. And I can't remember the full title. It was sort of a long title. But I had a survivor. He came on the podcast and talked about how he was being sex trafficked when he was a teenager in the United States. And he had an abuser that was like a friend, but an abuser, a neighbor. He played video games with him. They would pal around. They would joke around. And he would rape him. Then that got him into this sex trafficking, ring. And that was being led by a sadistic psychopath. That was a horrific monster of a human being. And so 20, 30 years later, he's telling me, after going through a lot of therapy, that he still has some compassion and warmth towards his initial abuser, even though he recognizes what he did to him was horrific and abusive and terrible. But the monster person, he has no warmth around, no compassion around. In the way that if the monster dies and he hears about it, he's not going to shed a tear. But the initial abuser, if he passes away, he might shed a tear. And this is a layer to the shame and the complexity of these situations. Is people will come to me or email in and they'll say that when they tell people about their childhood abuser or previous abusive individual, they will, of course, want support and a conversation around how they were victimized and how horrible that person was to them. They want that feedback from people around them. But occasionally, the victim wants to say, but, I have some nice memories. We had good times. And there's a part of that relationship that I think I miss. Is that okay? Is that okay with everyone? And a lot of people will say, no, that's just you getting back involved with that person, and that's victim mentality. No, that was 100% wrong. And what that does to the victim is it is more abuse to them. They feel shamed for having their normal reactivity. It's normal when you have that relationship, and we could call it manipulative, or it's possible, like with the Martha character, it's not hard to imagine that given her vulnerability, she actually had an inner humanity that actually did want tenderness and connection and love and attention and friendship or something. And it'd be okay. Donnie doesn't have to feel this way, but it'd be okay, in my book, if Donnie had occasional empathy and warmth toward the person, even after fully extracting and recovering, right? You can even kind of see it in the writing, that with the Darian character, there's no warmth there. There's no warmth in the writing. But with the Martha character, my goodness, there is a lot of empathy and warmth towards her, which I think really challenges people. And I've heard that from people that will say, what's wrong with this? He just keeps going back and all this kind of stuff. It's just like, I'm glad that people are asking that question, and it needs to be answered in an accurate way, and not answered in the typical way, which is, well, he asked for it. Donnie is weak. He should have left. It's his fault. That kind of nonsense. All right, well, let's adjourn there. Tune in next time when I continue watching. And everyone out there, please check in with yourself, truly. And take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.